Question. What links a modern symbol of popular protest with my favourite weekend breakfast, with a dystopian graphic novel from the 1980s, with a letter nailed to the door of a church, with a fat king who didn't like his wife, with a teenager who was Queen of England for less than 2 weeks, with a failed terror attack, with a 400-year-old national celebration? It's bonfire night in the UK.
Remember the 5th of November, the gunpowder, treason and plot. I know of no reason why the gunpowder treason should ever be forgot. First, the overture.
It all started in 1605 when a religious man was discovered in a room beneath the Houses of Parliament guarding 36 barrels of gunpowder which he hoped to use to blow up the House of Lords and kill the then King, James I, or James VI if you're Scottish, but that's a different story. Or is that really where it all began? Because to really understand why this happened, we need to understand what England was like at the time. And you can't begin to understand that without going back even further to perhaps the biggest shift in ideological, political, philosophical and religious ideas ever to have rocked Europe. It was called the European Reformation, and its influence can be seen in almost all subsequent European and global history. Up until the 16th century, there was really only one source of religious authority in Western Europe, the Catholic Church in Rome and its divine ruler, the Pope. Religion was at the heart of everything, and no one was really allowed to do anything unless the Pope authorised it. The Church had complete control, and because very few ordinary people could read or write, no one really knew anything about anything unless they'd heard it first from the Church. The Church was also rich. I mean, like mega rich. Finally, members of the clergy were just not very, well, godly. Those English monks we heard about last week were really a perfect target for raiding Vikings. Not only were they surrounded by unimaginable riches of exotic gold and jewels from across Christendom, they were also pretty drunk most of the time and frankly rubbish at fighting. Not like the warrior monks you may have encountered in Asian history. Then, on the 31st of October 1517, an angry German called Martin Luther nailed a letter to the door of his church in Wittenberg. Actually, he just wrote a letter to the bishop, but nailing to the door story sounds so much better, so that's the one we all learn in school now. The letter listed all his complaints about how the church was being run. This letter wasn't just your typical customer complaint. Luther's list ran to 95 separate items, from why can't we translate the Bible into our own language to why are you selling the body parts of dead saints as priority passes for rich people to get into heaven? Naturally, when the Pope heard about this, he was furious. Luther and his followers, called Protestants because they protested against the authority of the Catholic Church, were declared as heretics, and so began a holy rivalry which quickly ignited the whole of Europe. The handsome young king of England at the time was Henry VIII. Henry collected wives like Pokemon. Well, like Pokemon which you either throw away or have murdered when you get bored of them. Henry didn't take much interest in Reformation matters until 1531, when the Pope told him kings weren't allowed to just get rid of their wives. Henry was so upset by this, he decided to break England away from Rome and form a new church, the Church of England. Naturally, the only right people to put in charge of his new church were himself and his new wife, Anne Boleyn. I'm sure that's what God would have wanted. 4 wives later, and Henry was dead, passing his reign and leadership of his new church to his 9-year-old son, Edward VI. Sadly, Edward didn't last long, and he died of illness aged just 15. This was very awkward for the English church, because the next in line for the throne was his half-sister, Mary. Mary was the daughter of Henry's first wife, Catherine of Aragon. She was not a fan of the new church which her father had made up as an excuse to dump her mum. Not only was she a Catholic, she was also the wife of the king of one of England's biggest power rivals, Spain. In a panic, the English authorities quickly installed Henry's Protestant niece, Lady Jane Grey, as queen. Sadly for Lady Jane, Bloody Mary, as she became known, took no notice of that. She She marched into London with her supporters, executed the new Queen just 9 days after taking the throne, and for the first time in over 20 years, England went Catholic again. Those who had led the English Reformation were punished terribly, including the public burning at the stake of archbishops of the new church. And that might have been the end of things if Mary hadn't herself died 3 years later, leaving no heir to take over her now Catholic monarchy. Enter Elizabeth I, 25 years old, smart, charming, and, you guessed it, Protestant. She reigned for the next 40 years, saw England's power, wealth, and global influence grow, as well as promoting the arts and trade. The Protestant public saw this as evidence that God was smiling on the Church of England, and Catholics, or Papists as they were now called by their critics, became increasingly marginalised and abused. Elizabeth's cousin James took over after her death, and Catholics continued to be persecuted under her reign. So, now let's go back to Westminster 1605 to our man with the barrels of gunpowder. His name is Guy Fawkes, and he's a Catholic. Sick of the persecution of their people and believing that God wanted the country returned to the true Catholic faith, he and his friends have put together a plan to destroy the king and parliament, kidnap a princess, and install her as a Catholic queen on England's throne. But the plan was discovered the very night before the attack, and the terrorists were captured, put on trial, and executed. King James was so pleased at this that he declared a celebration to be held every 5th of November, and the occasion continues to be celebrated to this day. Although its religious significance is no longer a part of the celebrations, we still celebrate every 5th of November with bonfires, fireworks, and special food. Typically, an effigy of Guy Fawkes is built and burned on the fire on November the 5th. The hero, V, in the 1980s graphic novel by British writer Alan Moore, wears a mask based on the face of Guy Fawkes. The novel, and the 2005 movie based on it, is set in an imaginary Britain which is ruled by a totalitarian regime. The movie contains a funny scene in which V prepares breakfast for the movie's main protagonist, Evie. He calls this breakfast eggy in a basket. In recent decades, protesters around the world have used the mask worn by V as a symbol of their protests.
I hope you've enjoyed learning about this festival in the UK. Tell me about some festivals in your country. I look forward to hearing your ideas.